She just wanted to fix up her sick grandmother's house. But under a rotten floorboard, she found a secret that no one was supposed to know about. The house had been silent for decades until she opened the chest in the basement. See how it all ended? Subscribe and write in the comments which city you're watching from. The road stretched endlessly through the Louisiana countryside, shimmering under a sun that seemed too heavy for autumn. Rachel Pierce kept one hand on the steering wheel, the other loosely resting on the window frame. The air smelled faintly of salt and damp grass, and somewhere in the distance, she could see the lazy rise of cypress trees clustered around the bayou. Her GPS had stopped showing signs of life miles ago. She didn't need it anymore. She knew where she was going. It had been 14 years since she'd last driven this road. Back then, she'd been 18, head full of ambition and a scholarship letter in her pocket, convinced she would never come back to St. Mary Parish. But now she was 29, a journalist from Atlanta, returning not for a story, but for something that felt much heavier. The phone call had been brief, her mother's voice trembling before fading into static. Your grandmother doesn't have much time left. And now, here she was, following the same cracked asphalt that once led her away from everything she'd sworn to forget. The town hadn't changed much. The same rusted signs leaned at awkward angles. The same wooden porches sagged under the weight of years. But what had once looked small now felt almost sacred, like a memory she wasn't ready to touch. When she turned off onto the gravel path that led to her grandmother's property, the sky had begun to dim. The trees closed in like witnesses. Then the house appeared, still standing, barely on the far edge of the clearing. It was smaller than she remembered, though it hadn't shrunk. The years had simply stripped away her childhood awe. The roof sagged, the paint peeled in gray curls, and the porch rail hung loose on one side. A single window reflected the setting sun in a dull glow, as if the house itself was sighing. She parked the car under a dying oak, sat for a moment, and listened. The air hummed with cicadas. Somewhere, a crow cawed once and went silent. When Rachel stepped onto the porch, the boards gave beneath her feet. The door was already open, as though someone had been waiting. Inside, the smell of age hit her. Dust, wood rot, and faint traces of lavender soap. The walls, once cream-colored, were the dull yellow of parchment. Family photographs lined the mantel, their frames tarnished. In one, a younger version of her grandmother, Adeline, smiled faintly beside a man Rachel had never known. She touched the photo and felt the chill of the glass. "Close the door, child," came a voice behind her. Rachel turned. Her grandmother sat in an armchair by the window, wrapped in a thin blanket. Her eyes the same deep brown Rachel remembered. Sharp, observant, unreadable. The years had thinned her frame, but not her presence. "You came back," Adeline said simply. Rachel nodded, her throat tight. "I heard you weren't well." That's one way of putting it. The old woman smiled, but there was no humor in it. "I'm not dying just yet, but the house might beat me to it." Rachel looked around. "It's falling apart, Grandma. The roof's going to cave in if we don't fix it." Adeline's gaze drifted toward the ceiling. "This house has stood through storms, through silence, through worse things than you can imagine. Don't bury it yet." "I'm not burying it," Rachel said softly. "I'm trying to save it." Her grandmother nodded but didn't reply. The conversation hung between them like dust in the air, visible but untouchable. Over the next few days, Rachel began to settle in. The house creaked and groaned as if protesting her presence, yet she felt something oddly comforting about its decay. She cleaned the kitchen, mended torn curtains, and fixed the old radio that still sat on the counter. Every task brought her closer to memories she thought she'd buried. Baking cornbread with her grandmother, chasing fireflies in the yard, listening to stories whispered on hot summer nights. At night, when the lights flickered and the house fell silent, she could almost hear voices, soft, rhythmic murmurs, like someone talking just beyond the walls. Once, she woke to the sound of footsteps above her, faint but deliberate. The attic, she realized, hadn't been opened in years. The next morning she brought it up to Adeline. "Grandma, I think there's something in the attic." The old woman's eyes narrowed. "The past, maybe." "I'm serious. It sounded like footsteps." Adeline looked out the window. "Don't be too eager to find things that aren't ready to be found." Rachel didn't know what that meant, but she didn't ask again. Days turned into a quiet rhythm of repairs and silences. She patched holes in the roof, scrubbed away mold from the walls, and replaced cracked window panes. The work was hard, but it grounded her. There was something almost spiritual in the sound of hammer against nail, as if every strike was a heartbeat returning to the house. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being guided, that the house wanted her there for a reason. One afternoon, while clearing the upstairs bedroom, she found an old photograph wedged between the wallboards. It showed a young woman standing in a field, her dress plain but her posture proud. On the back, written in fading ink, was a name: Adeline Carter, 1864. Rachel frowned. The year didn't make sense. Her grandmother couldn't possibly have been alive then. She slipped the photo into her pocket, meaning to ask about it later, but something deep inside told her not to. Not yet. The evenings were the hardest. The house grew darker faster than the sky outside, and shadows stretched long across the floor. Sometimes she caught her grandmother staring at the ceiling, whispering to herself. Other times, she'd find her asleep with her hands folded over a thin notebook that she never let Rachel open. One night, as rain tapped softly against the windows, Rachel sat beside her. The air smelled faintly of dust and chamomile. "Do you ever regret staying here?" she asked quietly. Adeline's eyes fluttered open. "You think I stayed because I couldn't leave?" Rachel hesitated. "Didn't you?" The old woman smiled faintly. "No, child. I stayed because the house wasn't finished telling its story, and neither was I." They sat in silence for a long time after that. The rain grew heavier, then eased. Rachel thought she heard the faint echo of music, something like humming, rising from the floorboards. When she looked toward her grandmother, she was asleep again, her breathing shallow but peaceful. Later, in her room, Rachel wrote notes in her journal. "The house is falling apart. Grandma's hiding something. Photo Adeline Carter, 1864. She paused, pen hovering. "Feels like the walls are listening." As she turned out the light, she heard it again, the soft creak of footsteps from the attic. But this time, she didn't feel afraid. She lay still, listening, the sound blending with the wind, until she wasn't sure where one ended and the other began. Morning came with a thick mist that blurred the outlines of the trees. The air was cool, heavy with the smell of wet earth. Rachel stepped outside and looked at the house. The sagging porch, the chipped paint, the shutters clinging stubbornly to their hinges. It looked wounded, but alive. She felt an unexpected surge of tenderness. Maybe this was what her grandmother meant. Maybe the house wasn't just a shelter. It was memory made solid. When she went back inside, Adeline was already awake, sitting by the window. The light fell across her face, soft and golden. "You've been listening," the old woman said. "To what?" "The house." Rachel almost laughed, but something in her grandmother's tone stopped her. "What is it trying to tell me?" Adeline's eyes didn't leave the horizon. "That freedom costs more than a lifetime, and sometimes it takes two to finish paying for it." Rachel didn't understand. Not yet. But she felt the words settle deep inside her like a seed, waiting for rain. That night, as the sky turned violet and the air grew still, she decided she would open the attic. The night she decided to open the attic, the air was so still, it felt like the whole world was listening. The only sound came from the rustling of the trees outside and the faint hum of crickets in the distance. Rachel held a flashlight in one hand, the other trailing along the banister as she climbed the narrow stairs that creaked with each step. The beam of light cut through dust that hung in the air like suspended breath. It smelled of cedar and thyme. When she reached the top, she hesitated. The attic door was a heavy panel of warped wood, its hinges swollen with rust. She pushed once, twice, and it groaned open as if protesting her intrusion. Inside, the darkness was thick and intimate. Her flashlight swept across forgotten trunks, stacks of yellowed newspapers, and jars of nails lined up like sentinels. Everything was still except for the slow drifting of dust, shimmering in the beam. The space was colder than the rest of the house, as if it had been waiting untouched for years. She stepped forward, careful not to disturb the fragile floorboards, and the smell of old cloth and paper rose to meet her. In one corner, under a fraying quilt, she found a bundle wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine. It wasn't labeled, but something about the way it was tucked behind a crate made her chest tighten. She untied the knot and unfolded the cloth. Inside were several folded papers, browned and brittle, and beneath them, a small hand-drawn map. It showed winding trails, streams, and something that looked like a house marked with a small X. On the back, written in elegant cursive, were the words, Adeline Carter, 1864. Her breath caught. There it was again, the name she had seen on the photograph. And this time, it wasn't a coincidence. She spent the rest of the night studying the map, tracing its lines with her finger, wondering if it led somewhere nearby. When she finally came downstairs, dawn was already filtering through the curtains. Her grandmother was awake, sitting in her chair, eyes half closed, as though she'd been waiting. "You've been upstairs," Adeline said quietly, without turning her head. Rachel froze. "I was cleaning." "That's not all you were doing." The old woman's voice held no anger, only a weary certainty. "You found something." Rachel hesitated. "I found an old map, with your name on it. Or, at least, someone with your name." Her grandmother's hands tightened on the armrest. "That's not a name I use anymore." Rachel frowned. "What do you mean?" Adeline looked at her then, and for the first time, Rachel saw a glint of fear behind her calm. "Sometimes a name can chain you as much as any iron." The conversation ended there. Adeline turned her gaze back to the window, her silence heavier than any answer. Rachel stood for a moment, then quietly folded the map and slipped it into her pocket. That day she worked harder than usual, patching the porch steps and scraping off the old paint. But her mind stayed fixed on that name, on the year written beneath it. She wanted to ask again, to demand the truth, but she knew better. Her grandmother's silences were walls, pushed too hard, and they would never open again. So she waited. The house, she thought, would tell her when the time was right. Late that afternoon, while sweeping the floor of the back bedroom, her broom snagged on a loose plank. She knelt down and pried it up, expecting to find a mouse nest or forgotten nails. Instead, her fingers touched cold metal. It was a small key, tarnished green with age. Attached to it was half a brass tag, with the number 3 stamped into it. She turned it over in her palm. It didn't belong to any modern lock she knew. Her heart raced. She looked around the room, scanning the walls and furniture as though the answer might be visible. But there was nothing, just the steady ticking of the old clock in the hall and the sigh of wind through the trees. She pocketed the key. That evening, She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, the key beside her, and the map spread open under the weak light. Adeline sat across the room, knitting with slow, deliberate movements. Rachel could feel her grandmother's eyes on her, though the older woman never lifted her head. Finally, Rachel said, "There's a locked chest in the basement, isn't there?" Adeline's needles paused mid-air. "You've always been too curious for your own peace." "Does this key open it?" Adeline's gaze moved to the key, then away. "That chest was closed for a reason. What's inside isn't meant for the living." Rachel felt a shiver crawl up her spine. "What is it then?" Her grandmother didn't answer. Instead, she said softly, "If you open it, don't expect to close it again. Some truths stay with you forever." That night, when the house fell silent and Adeline was asleep, Rachel took a flashlight and the key and descended the narrow stairs to the basement. The air grew colder with each step. The scent of damp earth filled her nose, and her breath came out in pale clouds. The basement was little more than stone walls and dirt floor, cluttered with old tools, jars, and a wooden workbench covered in dust. Against the far wall stood a large wooden trunk bound with rusted iron bands. The key slid into the lock as though it had been waiting for her. When she turned it, the mechanism clicked, a sound so sharp it echoed through the quiet like a warning. She hesitated, then lifted the lid. Inside lay a bundle of papers tied with ribbon, a small leather-bound journal, and a piece of fabric with embroidered initials. AC. Beneath them, wrapped in a cloth, was a silver locket. She opened it and found a faded photograph of a young woman, her grandmother's face unmistakable even beneath the sepia tint, though she looked barely 16. On the opposite side of the locket was a single word etched in tiny letters. Freedom. Her fingers trembled as she opened the journal. The first page was dated 1864. The handwriting was elegant, the ink faded, but legible. The opening line sent a chill through her. I was born on a land where even my name wasn't mine. She turned page after page, reading words written in the voice of someone who had known fear and hunger, yet refused to surrender. The writer described nights of running through swamps, hiding from dogs, the terror of each dawn that might bring discovery. The entries spoke of loss of friends caught and punished, of a mother left behind, of a hope that refused to die. Every sentence felt like a heartbeat. And as she read, Rachel began to realize what she was holding wasn't just history. It was survival itself, pressed between fragile pages. When she reached the final entry, dated months after the first, she found a name signed at the bottom, Adeline Carter. And below that, faintly, almost invisible, another line written later in a shakier hand. If you find this, I am still running. Rachel sat on the cold basement floor, the words burning into her. The journal slipped from her hand and landed softly on the earth. She understood now. The woman in the photograph, the map, the name, all of it. Her grandmother wasn't just old. She was ancient, her life spanning generations hidden behind false dates and changed names. She had run from slavery, had built a new life, had buried her truth beneath floorboards and silence. Upstairs, she heard the slow creak of footsteps, her grandmother, awake again, or perhaps just the house settling into its memories. Rachel closed the trunk, holding the journal to her chest. She didn't know what to do with what she'd found. To tell, it would be to expose everything. To keep it secret would be to bury it again. The next morning, she found her grandmother sitting on the porch, wrapped in a shawl, eyes on the horizon. Rachel approached quietly, the journal tucked under her arm. Adeline didn't turn. "You opened it," the old woman said. "I had to," Rachel whispered. "I know." Adeline's voice trembled. "You were always going to." For a long moment, They sat in silence, the air thick with unspoken things. Then Adeline said softly, "That name, the one in the book, it used to be mine, before I ran, before I built this house." Rachel stared at her. "You built it yourself?" "With these hands," she said, holding them out. "Thin, veined, but strong. Piece by piece. Every board nailed was a prayer, every wall a promise that no one would ever own me again." "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Adeline smiled faintly. "You think the world was ready to listen to a story like mine? Even now, they only listen when it suits them." Rachel wanted to argue, to say that things had changed, but she couldn't. Instead, she said, "You left all this hidden." "I had to. Some stories need time to grow into truth. You were the one meant to find it, Rachel. You, not your mother, not anyone else." "Why me?" "Because you listen," Adeline said, her eyes shining. "You listen the way this house does." Rachel felt tears sting her eyes. She wanted to promise she would tell the story, write it, preserve it. But her grandmother raised a hand. "Not yet," Adeline said. "When I'm gone, you'll know what to do. Until then, let me rest." That evening, as the sun sank low and painted the house in copper light, Rachel sat on the porch steps, the journal open on her lap. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. The house was quiet now, but it didn't feel empty. It felt watchful, protective, as if it had seen everything and was still guarding what remained. The air smelled of earth and rain, and the trees whispered softly around her. She thought of the map upstairs, the trails marked on it, the X, drawn like a secret waiting to be found. She knew this was only the beginning, that the story of Adeline Carter, the girl who ran and survived, had just begun to breathe again through her hands. And in the whispering of the walls, she thought she could hear her grandmother's voice, calm and steady. "Don't be afraid of what the house shows you. It remembers for a reason." Rachel closed the journal, pressed it to her heart, and whispered back, "I'm listening." The wind carried her words through the cracked shutters and over the roof, and somewhere in the timbers of the old house, a quiet sigh seemed to answer. The next morning dawned quiet and heavy, as if the world itself needed time to breathe after what had been unearthed. A soft fog had rolled over the fields behind the house, and through it, the faint silhouette of cypress trees looked like ghosts standing watch. Rachel sat at the kitchen table with the journal spread open before her. The pages smelled faintly of smoke and soil. The ink faded to a soft brown. She ran her fingers over the handwriting, graceful, deliberate, the hand of someone who had learned to write against all odds. Each word drew her deeper into the life of the girl her grandmother had once been. Adeline Carter, 16 years old, born on a plantation not far from where this very house stood. The entries spoke of heat so thick it turned the air to syrup, of dawns that began with the crack of a whip, of evenings when the stars were the only mercy left. She described hiding behind the smokehouse, tracing letters in the dirt with a stick while pretending to gather herbs. Her mother had taught her the alphabet in whispers, careful to stop whenever footsteps approached. "Freedom begins with a word," her mother had said, "and ends with the courage to speak it." As Rachel read, the past and present blurred. She could hear the rhythm of those days, the creak of the plantation gate, the clink of iron chains, the low hum of voices singing under their breath to keep despair at bay. Adeline's words painted it all so vividly that Rachel could almost feel the weight of that summer, the suffocating heat, the taste of fear, the defiance that flickered in every breath. One night, after a particularly brutal punishment witnessed in silence, Adeline wrote of her decision to run. "I have no map, no coin, no shoes fit for the road," she had written. "But I have the stars. They have never lied. She described the plan in fragments, how she would slip away under the cover of thunder, how the dogs would lose her scent in the rain, how she would follow the North Star until the ground beneath her feet no longer belonged to anyone. Rachel's eyes stung as she read the pages that followed. The girl's flight was not triumphant. It was desperate, ragged, almost feral. Adeline had crossed swamps, crawled through brambles, and slept in hollow logs while leeches clung to her legs. The entries turned shaky, the handwriting uneven. "I can hear them behind me," one read. "I don't know if it's them or my own heart." But then came a shift, an entry written in steadier script. "I met her today," it began. "A woman in a gray dress by the river. She said her name was Mary. She is not from here. She speaks soft, but walks like she's carried weight heavier than chains. She says she helps people find the road to freedom." Rachel read that line again and again. The idea that her grandmother, a runaway slave, had encountered a woman from the North, an abolitionist, risking her life to help others, felt like a story out of legend. Yet the details were too plain, too human to be fiction. Mary had hidden Adeline in a root cellar, brought her food, cleaned the wounds on her feet, and told her where the nearest safe settlement was. Together, they had built a small shelter deep in the woods, using scraps of timber and sheets of tin stolen from a collapsed barn. That shelter, the journal revealed, had stood on the very land where the house now stood. Rachel closed the book, her hands trembling. The walls around her seemed to pulse with meaning. Every creak, every flaw in the plaster was no longer just decay. It was memory. This house was not just where her grandmother had lived. It was what she had built to replace a prison with a home. Later that day, Rachel sat beside Adeline, who dozed lightly in her chair. The afternoon light fell across the old woman's face, turning her skin to gold and shadow. Rachel wanted to tell her what she had read, to ask about Mary, to ask about the escape. But something in her grandmother's breathing stopped her. There was peace there, but also exhaustion, as if even memory was too heavy to carry any longer. When Adeline stirred, Rachel said quietly, "I read your journal." The old woman didn't open her eyes. "And what did you learn? That you ran? That you built this place yourself?" Adeline gave a faint smile. "Ran is too pretty a word. I crawled. I bled. I hid. But I lived. That's what I did." Rachel reached for her hand. It was warm, fragile, but steady. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Adeline's eyes opened then, sharp and clear. "Because freedom isn't safe, child, not even when they say it is. They take your chains off your wrists and wrap them around your name instead." She looked toward the window, where the light had begun to fade. "I changed mine so they couldn't find me. Adeline Carter died in the swamp. Adeline Pierce was born when I built this house." The truth settled over them like dust. Rachel wanted to ask 1,000 more questions, but her grandmother's gaze drifted back to the horizon, and she knew it was enough for now. That night, unable to sleep, Rachel returned to the journal. Near the end, she found pages written decades later in a different hand. Her grandmother's more familiar one. The entries were dated only a few years ago. "I have begun to write again," one said. "So much was left unsaid. They think history ends when you escape, but the running never stops. I built this home to keep my story safe, but perhaps I built a prison of silence instead." In the margins, she had scribbled possible titles: "My Road to Freedom," "The Girl Who Ran," "The Road Back to Freedom." Rachel traced the last one with her finger. The words felt alive. The following morning, she found another bundle of pages hidden behind a false drawer in the old writing desk. These were more recent drafts of her grandmother's memoir, typed on an ancient machine, the ink faint and uneven. The sentences were raw, confessional. "Sometimes I dream I'm still running," one began. "Only now the dogs are memories, and they never stop barking." Rachel read until her eyes ached. The story was more than history. It was testimony, an inheritance written in ink and pain. She realized then that her grandmother hadn't hidden it out of shame. She had hidden it because the world wasn't ready to hear it. That evening, as the sun sank low and the fields glowed copper and red, Rachel brought the journal to the porch. Adeline was there, wrapped in her shawl, the cool breeze tugging at the edges of her blanket. Rachel sat beside her in silence for a while before speaking. "I think you were trying to finish this," she said, placing the pages in her lap. "But you stopped." Adeline looked down at the stack, her hands trembling slightly. "Some stories take more than one lifetime to finish." "Then let me help you," Rachel said. "Let me help you finish it." Adeline's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Finally, she whispered, "Promise me you'll tell it true. Don't let them turn it into pity." "I promise." Her grandmother nodded and closed her eyes, her breath coming slow and steady. The porch fell silent except for the low hum of cicadas. For a moment, Rachel thought she heard music again, faint, like a song carried on the wind. In the days that followed, she transcribed every word, carefully preserving the voice that spoke through time. Each sentence felt sacred. She began adding notes of her own, her reflections, her emotions, her questions. It wasn't just her grandmother's story anymore. It was theirs. But the winter came early that year, and with it, her grandmother's strength began to fade. Some mornings, she no longer recognized where she was. Other times, her clarity was sharp enough to pierce through Rachel's resolve. "When spring comes," she said one evening, her voice barely audible, "you'll know what to do. Not before. The story isn't ready." Rachel wanted to believe there would still be time, that her grandmother would see the world remember her as she deserved. But deep down, she knew that spring would come too late. On the night the frost came, Rachel sat awake by her grandmother's side. The fire burned low, casting flickering light across the walls. Adeline slept, her breathing thin and uneven. In her lap lay the unfinished manuscript, her fingers resting gently on the pages, as though guarding them. Rachel stayed like that until the first gray light of dawn touched the horizon. When she finally rose, the house was silent, heavier than it had ever been. Her grandmother was gone. Rachel walked outside, the cold morning air sharp in her lungs. The sky was pale and endless, the fields glistening with frost. She looked back at the house her grandmother had built from fear and faith, and whispered a promise she would spend the rest of her life keeping. She would tell the story. She would finish the road back to freedom. And as she turned to go back inside, she thought she heard, just for an instant, a voice in the wind whispering, "Now it's your turn to run." The morning after the frost lingered like a second silence. The air carried a thin veil of mist, and the grass glittered beneath the first rays of light. Rachel stood by the window, the unfinished manuscript clutched to her chest. Her grandmother's chair sat empty, draped with the same shawl she had worn every evening. The house felt both hollow and impossibly full. Every breath, every creak, every shadow seemed to hold the weight of the woman who had built it. She moved slowly, as though afraid to disturb something sacred. On the kitchen table, a single teacup remained half full, its surface covered with a thin film. The scent of chamomile lingered faintly in the air, mingling with the musty sweetness of the old wood. Rachel touched the cup, her fingers trembling, and whispered, "I'll finish it." The next few days passed in a blur of ritual and exhaustion. The townspeople came and went, offering casseroles and condolences, all unaware of the history that had just ended and the one about to begin again. They spoke of Adeline Pierce as a kind, quiet woman, generous at church picnics, good with children, faithful until the end. No one knew she had once been Adeline Carter, that she had run through the swamps barefoot, that her hands had built the very home they now stood in. Rachel listened to them, her heart swelling with a quiet grief. The world had always seen her grandmother as something smaller than she truly was. But Rachel had read her words. She knew better. After the burial, Rachel found herself unable to leave. The thought of returning to her apartment in Atlanta, to her deadlines and polished articles, felt absurd. The story was still here, unfinished, breathing in the dust of every room. She spent long nights at the desk, surrounded by the smell of old paper and candle wax, transcribing her grandmother's journals. Her fingers cramped from typing. Her eyes ached, but she pressed on. Each sentence she transcribed felt like unearthing a heartbeat. Adeline's voice flowed through her, clear and steady, guiding her hand, as if she were dictating from somewhere just beyond the reach of the living. The more Rachel wrote, the more she realized the manuscript wasn't just a personal story. It was a map of survival. It was history seen from beneath the floorboards, the untold truth of a nation that had tried to forget. The book became a bridge between two worlds, one of chains and one of silence. And she, the granddaughter of a woman who had built her own freedom, was the one chosen to cross it. Weeks turned into months. The winter thawed into a pale, hesitant spring. The magnolia tree in the yard blossomed with white petals, so pure they looked like fragments of sky. On those mornings, Rachel would carry her laptop to the porch and type beneath the open air. She imagined her grandmother sitting beside her, silent but approving, the faint scent of lavender floating on the breeze. The house no longer felt decayed. Its worn wood and creaking beams seemed alive now, like the ribs of a sleeping giant stirring back to life. When she finally typed the last line, "I am finally free," the clock on the wall struck midnight. She sat there staring at the words, her chest heavy, her hand still hovering over the keyboard. She could feel tears burning behind her eyes, not of sadness, but of release. The story was finished, though it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning that had been waiting more than a century to be born. She spent another month editing, writing a preface in her own voice. In it, she told the truth, that Adeline Pierce and Adeline Carter were one and the same, that her grandmother had been born enslaved and had fled to build a life from the ashes of fear. She described finding the journals, the nights she spent piecing together the fragments of a history the world had buried. She titled it, "The Road Back to Freedom," and signed it as both of them, by Adeline Carter and Rachel Pierce. When she mailed the manuscript to a publisher in New York, she didn't expect much. The literary world was fickle, and history told by those who had lived its darkest corners rarely found an easy welcome. Yet 2 weeks later, the editor called her personally. His voice was low, reverent. "Miss Pierce," he said, "this is not just a story. It's a resurrection." The book was published in the fall. On the day of its release, Rachel stood outside a small bookstore in New Orleans, watching people line up to buy it. The cover bore her grandmother's photograph, a sepia image of the young woman standing in a field, her eyes calm and unyielding. Beneath it, the title glimmered in gold letters. When Rachel held the first printed copy in her hands, the paper felt warm, as though the ink itself remembered what it had once been. She ran her fingers over her grandmother's name and whispered, "We did it." The world responded faster than she could have imagined. Universities added the book to their reading lists. Scholars called it one of the most important, first-hand narratives of resilience in modern American history. News anchors quoted her grandmother's lines, about the meaning of freedom, and children recited them at school assemblies. The story spread beyond what Rachel had dreamed, carried by the voices of those who recognized themselves in it. Her grandmother's words had finally found their audience, not through pity, but through truth. But the most profound moment came months later, when Rachel returned to St. Mary Parish for the dedication of the Adeline Carter Memorial House. The town council had voted unanimously to restore the home and convert it into a museum and educational center. On the morning of the ceremony, Rachel stood in the front yard among a small crowd of locals, historians, and students. The house gleamed under a fresh coat of paint, the porch rebuilt, the roof straight and strong once more. A bronze plaque had been placed by the steps. It read, "Here lived Adeline Carter, who ran and never stopped running." When Rachel stepped forward to speak, she felt her voice tremble, but she didn't try to steady it. "My grandmother built this house with her own hands," she began. "Every wall here was once a boundary, and she turned them into shelter. Every nail was a prayer. Every board, a promise. She didn't just build a home. She built a testament to the strength of those who refuse to be forgotten." She paused, the wind tugging gently at her hair. "This house remembers freedom, and now, so will we." After the ceremony, when the crowd dispersed and the sun began to set, Rachel stayed behind. She walked through each room slowly, her footsteps echoing softly against the wooden floor. The room smelled faintly of lemon oil and sunlight. In the study, her grandmother's desk had been polished to a soft sheen. On it rested the original journal, displayed behind glass. Rachel leaned over and traced the reflection of the words she knew by heart. She could almost see her grandmother's hands moving across the page, hear the quiet rhythm of her breath as she wrote in the dim light of an oil lamp. Outside, the last light of evening bathed the magnolia tree in gold. Rachel sat on the porch steps, the air warm and thick with the scent of spring. Fireflies drifted lazily across the yard, and the sound of the river carried through the stillness. She opened a new copy of The Road Back to Freedom and flipped to the final page, the one she had added herself. The line read, "Freedom isn't something you find. It's something you rebuild, beam by beam, story by story." She whispered the words aloud, letting them linger in the twilight. She thought of all the women who had come before her, her grandmother, her great-grandmother, the countless others whose names history never learned to pronounce. She thought of the hands that picked cotton, that mended fences, that stitched dresses by candlelight, and how those same hands had carried courage like fire. Their stories had been written in blood and erased in silence, but now one had survived. One had spoken, and it was enough to ignite the rest. A light breeze swept across the yard, and the branches of the magnolia swayed gently. The house creaked softly, not in protest, but in recognition. Rachel smiled. For the first time, she didn't feel alone. The weight of the past no longer pressed on her. It moved with her, beside her, like a companion walking home. She stood and looked back at the house one last time. The windows glowed faintly with reflected moonlight, and for an instant, she thought she saw a figure in the window, her grandmother, standing just where she had always been, gazing out toward the fields. It wasn't frightening. It felt right. Rachel lifted her hand, a silent farewell, and turned toward the gate. As she walked down the dirt path, the night grew darker, but the stars burned bright above her. Those same stars her grandmother had once followed north through the swamps. They had guided one woman to freedom, and now, generations later, they guided another toward purpose. The wind stirred again, carrying with it a faint whisper that could have been the sigh of the house, or the voice of a woman long gone but never lost. It said, as softly as a prayer, "Keep running." Rachel smiled through her tears and whispered back into the night, "I will." Then she kept walking, the glow of the house fading behind her until it became one with the horizon. Steady, enduring, eternal, like freedom itself. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Watch the next video. There's always another story waiting to be told. And if you think someone else should hear this one, share it with them. Every share helps keep these stories alive.